What is your center? What is a center? Everyone has a center, and sometimes we're not really aware as to what our center is. But the center is the part of us from which we derive wisdom, power, security, and guidance. And when we say security, we mean also our self-worth. When we say guidance, we mean our direction in life. So whenever we have to make a critical decision, then we need guidance. That guidance should come from within. Specifically, our guidance comes from our center. So what is your center? Well, I'm going to talk about what your center should be. But first, let's discuss some bad centers. For some people, their center is themselves. They are what we call self-centered. Okay, we all have to be selfish a little bit in life, but it's not a good idea to be self-centered because that causes us to alienate the people around us. It causes us to behave selfishly. Yourself should not be your center. Is it good to be work-centered? And the answer is, again, no. Okay, and many people are work-centered, and we often don't think of that as a bad thing. A lot of people, get their sense of direction, their sense of security, their sense of purpose from work. People who are work-centered, sometimes, they might get fired, and then they go to pieces. They enter a deep depression, and they start to think, without my job, like, what am I? Even worse than being work-centered is being money-centered, and there are a lot of people out there who are money-centered. All they care about is how much money they have, and their pursuit of money drives them in their life. Their pursuit of money, provides direction, which can be very harmful because all of their self-worth, comes from how much money they have. So being money-centered is also harmful. Okay, finally, something else that's very common is there are some people who are completely centered on their partner, on their romantic partner, whether that's their husband or wife, whether that's a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Being centered around your partner can also be a source of great unhappiness. And oftentimes we see people who are centered around their partner, they're in what we might call codependent relationships, where they're completely dependent on their partner's completely dependent on them, and they're simply not able to function, outside of that relationship. Being partner-centered can lead to, insane jealousy. So what should your center be? What is a good center? And the answer is principles are a good center. You need to be principle-focused. What are good principles? Well, honesty and being genuine are some really good principles. Kindness is another very good principle. And, if we have the wrong center, if we're not principle-centered in our life, then that's going to lead us to make bad decisions. Okay, so let me tell you two stories. Story number one is a guy, let's call him Jimmy. Jimmy began the year 2026 with a few goals in mind. Number one, he said that he was going to completely abstain from alcohol and marijuana. Those are also good principles. Like if sobriety is important to you, then, maintaining your sobriety is a good principle. But Jimmy had another goal. For the year 2026, he said, I'm going to find a romantic partner. I'm going to find a girlfriend for myself. That's what Jimmy was saying. Sometimes some people are centered around, the partner that they have. Some people are centered around a partner that they don't have. So unfortunately, I think Jimmy was sort of girlfriend-centered, even though he didn't have a girlfriend, but that was his goal. He, sort of said to himself subconsciously or unconsciously, he said, I'm going to get a girlfriend in the year 2026. And that became his center. Okay, so Jimmy had a date, and, I talked to him a few days later. I said, hey, Jimmy, how was your date the other night? And he said, Neil, it didn't go so well. I said, Jimmy, why didn't it go so well? And he said, well, number one, I shared a bottle of wine with my date. And, afterward, we smoked a joint. We smoked marijuana. And I said, well, Jimmy, why did you do that? Like, you told me that your goal for 2026 was to completely abstain from alcohol and marijuana. Jimmy told me, oh, my date, said that she really wanted to drink wine and she hates to drink alone. Okay, and then after we had some wine, she said, oh, I really want to smoke some marijuana. So we went and bought some marijuana and we smoked a joint together. Okay, so right away, Jimmy was not principle focused. He was girlfriend focused. Like this was his first date with this girl, but he was so centered around getting a girlfriend that he betrayed his principles. Okay, so that's my first story. We'll call that the parable of Jimmy. Okay, so this is how having the wrong center can lead you astray. Okay, by the way, did Jimmy end up, going on multiple dates with this girl and, falling in love with her and living happily ever after? No. Jimmy said, clearly there's not going to be a second date because this girl that I went on the date with, she wouldn't stop asking me about how much money I make. She was asking me about like what my job is, how much money I make this year, how much money I'm going to make next year, and how much money I have in my bank account. And I said, Jimmy, that's a big, big red flag. It's clear that this girl is money focused, right? Like her goal of dating is to find someone who's wealthy, who could financially support her. She's clearly insecure about her own financial situation, and that's why on the first date she grilled you about how much money you make and how much money you have in your bank account. I think Jimmy himself saw these red flags as well, but he chose to ignore them because Jimmy was, girlfriend focused. He was girlfriend centered. Okay, that's the first story. That's the parable of Jimmy. Okay, the second story is, a young kid, let's call him Bob. And Bob is in high school. He's a very good student. He's in his senior year of high school and he's applying to colleges. That being a student is his job. And that getting into a good college is very important for Bob. I talked to Bob and I said, hey, Bob, how are college applications going? And, Bob said, oh, I'm attending all these club meetings at the last minute. Like, I started going to Model UN meetings. I started going to, drama club. I started going to the Math Olympiad because, my resume is very sparse. Like, I'm not going to get into college with whatever activities I already have. Okay, and I asked Bob, like, well, Bob, did you do any extracurriculars when you were in high school? And Bob said, yeah, I did a few things. I did this organization called Chemistry Club, and I also ran track. But I'm afraid that that's not enough. Like now that I'm applying to colleges, I'm seeing like all my friends applying to colleges. They've got such impressive resumes. Like there's no way I'm going to get into a good college with just a few activities that I have. So what's going on with Bob? Bob could choose to be principle centered, and one of the most important principles is being genuine. So Bob could choose to simply apply to colleges the way he is. He ran track, he did chemistry club. That's not a ton of things, but that's a few things that he did. Instead, Bob is so obsessed almost with going to a prestigious college that he's now trying to inflate his resume with a bunch of activities that he hasn't really done, that he's just like doing them at the last minute in December of senior year. And why is he acting like this? Like, why is he choosing to be less than genuine? Well, he's student-centered, I guess, or maybe we should call it college-centered. Okay, Bob has become college-centered. Okay, he's been told that his sense of worth is going to come from attending a prestigious college. And as a result of that, he's betraying one of the most important principles, which is just to be genuine. Colleges have admissions officers who are good at their job, who are experienced. And they can tell when people are being less than genuine. They can tell when a student is so desperate to get into the school that they're inflating their resume or padding their resume. Okay, there's some students out there who think like, oh, all students do that. All students pad their resume. Maybe a lot of students do, but the most successful students in life are the ones who are genuine. Okay, they choose to represent themselves as they are. They choose to be who they really are instead of being what they think other people want them to be. If you ever want to hear more about finding your center, what is a good center and what is a bad center, if you want to read more about how to live a principle-centered life, well, a lot of this information is in the second chapter of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. In 7 Habits, the first habit is being proactive, which means being in charge of your own destiny. The second habit is begin with the end in mind, which means, simply put, you have to be aware of where you're going, of where you want to go, and you got to make the right decisions to get there. And the only way to make the right decisions is to be principle-centered. This information about having the right center, what it means to have a principle-centered life, that's in chapter 2 of 7 Habits. Check it out.